I'm still getting used to using the new GorillaPod mount. I got a new GorillaPod because I had lost mine, but I got the one with the head instead of the one without the head. And I'm still trying to get used to that because it's not a head that I'm used to. Man, it got really bright out while I was getting coffee. You know, sketchy shots like this actually take a lot more to do than you might think, because you gotta like climb out, find some stable rocks to put it on, and then come back and go. You're basically walking across all these sketchy rocks like 4 times. But you know what? The shot looks good, doesn't it? I don't actually know. I'll leave a title down below telling you whether I think the shot was worth the potential of my camera falling in the water. And now that we got coffee, B-roll, and skating around out of the way, let's talk about the topic of the video, which is, should you get a gimbal? Do you need a gimbal for the Canon M50? Now, I get asked a lot what gimbal is best for the M50, or if you should get a gimbal for the M50, or what gimbal do I suggest for the M50? And usually when I get that question, I give a completely non-committal answer because I've only ever used one gimbal with this camera. I've used the Moza Air, like the original Moza Air gimbal. And that gimbal is definitely not the best for the M50 because the M50 barely can balance on it. That gimbal is made for much bigger cameras. The only reason I've used it was because a friend of mine owns it and he let me borrow it for as long as I want to. And when I'm talking about gear, I don't like to suggest gear that I've never touched. And so I don't want to suggest a gimbal to someone, say a Feiyutech or a Zhiyun or even a Ronin, that I've never touched, I've never used. And if you're looking for information on a specific gimbal, I'm definitely not the person. I know general information about just about every gimbal there is, but I have no experiential knowledge of any gimbal except the Moza Air. But then it comes the question of, do you need a gimbal? And there has been a slew of videos recently because of the gimbal craze. There was a huge craze of gimbals where everyone was getting a gimbal, everyone was doing videos on gimbal, and then more recently there's come a slew of videos saying, no, you don't need a gimbal, you just need to do these tips or shoot handheld or learn better, stabilize your camera by hand. And basically I wanted to add my voice and maybe try and give you a voice in all of the noise that can tell you whether or not you should get a gimbal, whether or not a gimbal is worth it, whether or not you can do everything that you can do with a gimbal with a handheld or with a Steadicam. And the answer really is, if you need a gimbal, yes, you need a gimbal. Gimbals are a tool. Gimbals are a specific tool made for a specific reason. My head's... That's better. If you wondered why I went out of focus, using a manual lens again. After seeing a few videos going back to my kit lens from my manual lens, I've just been like, but back to gimbals is, gimbals are a tool, and they're a tool made for a specific purpose. Gimbals were created to solve the problems that you had with Steadicams. Steadicams were created for you to solve the problems that you had with handheld or shoulder mounted. There's a reason why gimbals exist and everyone wasn't satisfied with the Steadicams. For one, gimbals are easier to use than Steadicams. For two, gimbals, handheld gimbals, can get shots that you just could never get with a Steadicam. You're not going to be taking your big Steadicam with the foot on the bottom and putting it through a window this size. You can do that with a gimbal. You could do it handheld, but you're not going to get the stability that you would get with a gimbal. And so the answer really to start out with is yes. For gimbal shots, you need a gimbal. You cannot do it handheld. You cannot do it with a Steadicam. In order to get gimbal shots, you have to have a gimbal. Now that doesn't mean that you can't get smooth footage handheld, because like I said, I don't use a gimbal. I don't use a Steadicam. All of my video on my channel, almost all of my video on my channel is done handheld. And I've gotten pretty good doing handheld. All the video that you've seen in this video was either locked down on my GorillaPod or it was handheld. And you can get great stable footage handheld by just practicing with it. So the answer is yes. In order to get gimbal shots, specific shots that the gimbal was made to get, you do need a gimbal. But you don't need a gimbal to get stabilized footage. You kind of get what I'm saying, is that handheld footage can be really stable. You can make beautiful handheld shots, you can make beautiful Steadicam shots, and you can make beautiful gimbal shots. And some of the shots wouldn't look much different from one shot to the next using the different stabilizer equipment, because they know how to do these shots really well in every way. Like orbiting shots, you don't really need a gimbal for. You can do the orbital shots like I was doing in this video, handheld, no problem, but you're not gonna be able to throw in a 200mm lens and do an orbiting shot around someone on their face with just their face in the frame with handheld. That's something that a gimbal is good for. And so before you ask yourself, should I get a gimbal for the M50? I think you need to ask, what am I shooting with the M50? What do I want a gimbal for? Now, one thing you gotta keep in mind when figuring out if you need a gimbal or not is what lenses you're using, because stabilized lenses you don't need a gimbal for as much as you do with non-stabilized lenses like I'm using right now. You also got to keep in mind your focal length, because it's easier to shoot stable footage handheld when you're using a 10mm than when you're using a 100mm. And so if you like the look of telephotos like my friend Cody, then a gimbal is definitely something to consider more than if you always shoot everything at 10 or 16mm. Another reason to get a gimbal is those large movements, running, walking, those types of movement. When you're doing those, it is very difficult to do those handheld. I mean, if you're trying to run across a field while just holding your camera, it's just not that steady. Now, obviously, all those reasons for getting a gimbal are pretty obvious. I mean, it stabilizes your footage, is pretty obvious, and the longer your lenses, the more stabilization you need. But I did want to share 3 reasons why you might not want a gimbal, which are the 3 reasons I haven't gotten a gimbal. First one of those reasons is ease of use. Using a gimbal, I know people say, oh, it's way easier than using a Steadicam. You get the hang of it really quickly. Yes, that's true, but in order to get really good gimbal shots, you still have to practice a lot. It takes a while to get good with a gimbal, to get really good shots, because it's not just about getting stable footage, it's about getting good shots. And sometimes actually when you have stable footage, you don't realize that the shot isn't actually that good. Another is time. It takes time to set up a gimbal. It takes time to tear down a gimbal. It takes time to use a gimbal. It's not just like taking a camera handheld, which is what I normally do, and just shooting B-roll. You have to remember that gimbals take time to use. And that leads into my last point. And that last one is when I was borrowing that gimbal for like 6 months and then 3 months, I used it maybe 4 times. I almost never used it. It was so much of a hassle to get it set up and to get it balanced, because as I said, I had difficulty with that it wasn't worth it. It would have actually slowed me down and made it more difficult for me to make content. And really, any gear that you should get should make it easier to create the content you want to make. If it's not going to help you make something, then you shouldn't get it. And really, don't get a gimbal because someone else tells you to, and don't not get a gimbal because I don't have one. Look at what your needs are, and then get what you need. Don't worry about what other people need, what other people like. Figure out what you like and what you need, and then get that. Oh, and this is my old iPhone. A lot of you know what I'm talking about now.